that man was locked up for a very, very long time. So he should be, A, for perpetrating a murder, which is a very evil thing to do, and B, for sheer stupidity. He suspects that, it might have been a gun, or it might have been cash, or it might have been both. He doubts that he was, burying a Agatha Christie novel or something. They put two and two together and said, I wonder if that was Damien Eyre's pistol. I'm Andrew Rule, this is Life and Crimes. It's 33 years ago this month since the gunshots that echoed over South Yarra killed two young policemen who basically paid with their lives for the barbaric actions of others. Now, that looks fairly obvious that they were killed by barbaric actions, but the real story is that they were killed by very evil criminals in revenge because one of the evil criminals' friends was shot dead in what I would call a reckless action by armed robbery squad detectives. That judgment hasn't been borne out by the courts, but it would appear to be what a lot of people think. The dead police at Walsh St were young Steve Tynan and an even younger Damien Eyre. And I think listeners will know that many, many years ago, I happened to visit the Eyre family in Shepparton while researching a particular book. While I was talking to his father, who was a country policeman called Frank Eyre, this nice young bloke turned up. He'd been out all night and most of the day to celebrate the fact that he'd just joined the police force. And he looked like, a kid who just stepped off a skateboard, is the way I've put it over the years. He might even have had an earring. He was, jeans, blonde hair, T-shirt, very casual, lean, normal, older teenager, looked about 19, might have been 19 or so. And he was off to join the police to follow in his father's footsteps, and within 12 months he was shot dead with his colleague Steve Tynan in Walsh St, South Yarra, through absolutely no fault of his own. Those two boys bore the brunt of basically a vendetta between out-of-control crooks and armed robbery detectives who weren't much better when it came to indiscriminate use of firearms, some might say, including the relatives of a couple of people who were shot dead. The shooting at Walsh St was an outrage. It was a terrible thing. It was rather like the shooting of Gary Silk and Rod Miller, the two police, in Moorabbin in August 1998, which of course was 10 years later. And in many ways, they were the worst incidents, I think, in Victoria for incidents against police since the three troopers ambushed by the Kelly gang in 1878 at Stringy Bark Creek up near Mansfield. That's an anniversary which has, of course, been marked this month by descendants of those three murdered officers, Kennedy, Lonigan and Scanlon, whose names live on in the police memorials where Steve Tynan and Damien Eyre and Gary Silk and Rod Miller and many other police have their names recorded because they died in the line of duty. But memories fade and so do scars. But I think the Walsh St shots still echo down the years. And one of the reasons is that the men charged with the shooting, and, correctly charged, they were charged with it because they did it, they were acquitted by a jury, not because they were innocent, but because the combined efforts of the Victoria Police at that time could not nail a watertight case against them. In the end, the killers and their lawyers outmanoeuvred investigators in what I would call a ghastly poker game with no winners. Some claim that one side of the divided police task force that worked on this case, the Thai Air Task Force, some would say that some of those detectives mishandled Their key witness, Wendy Pearce, who's well known to many people listening. She, of course, was the wife of the suspected Walsh Street ringleader, Victor Pearce, career criminal, son of the notorious Kath Pettingill, brother of several career crooks, including the notorious Dennis Bruce Allen, known as Mr. Death. Victor Pearce was a cunning, devious, nasty, violent piece of work, and his wife Wendy had spent her life with him for reasons you can't fathom. There's two sides to the Wendy Pearce witness theory. The other people on the other side of the argument say that Wendy deliberately sabotaged the police case from inside and was always going to, and that she actually conned the prosecution to rely on her so heavily that when she flipped at the 11th hour, at the last minute, they were sunk. Now, whether that's what happened, whether she did it deliberately and planned it ahead, or whether she suddenly decided that the police weren't looking after her well enough and were taking her too cheaply or whatever, the net result was the same. She did flip, she did change her testimony, and that pulled a vital brick from the wall of the prosecution case against the Walsh Street shooters. And without her testimony, a jury basically sniffed at this parade of selective facts and selective falsehoods and rejected the police's fairly patchy version of events. And the jury, correctly under the law, I would say, let the killers walk. And no one's saying the jury should not have done that, because on the evidence put before it, that was the reasonable verdict. It was a verdict that senior police were very frightened would lead to repercussions. I recall it clearly when the verdict came out on that, I think it was an afternoon in 1989 from memory. There was an urgent message sent out to all police units by D24, by the Police Communications Centre, urging all police to stay calm and not to take any revenge action or anything like that, because senior police quite rightly were frightened that several police would take it into their heads to take the law into their own hands and go around and dish out some rough justice to the members of the families that were involved in the Walsh Street shooting. And that was mainly the Kath Pettingill brood, the Allens and the Pearces and the Pettingills, all that lot, and their relatives and friends and cousins and all the rest of it. It didn't actually happen. The police controlled themselves and did the right thing. But, of course, by that stage of the trial, all but one of the main suspects were either destined to die violently or already had. And let's go through those. Gary Abdallah, who was suspected of supplying the car used by the Walsh Street shooters as bait to get the police there. And Gary Abdallah was wanted by police for very good reason, apart from Walsh Street. He was wanted by police over a nightclub fire and for running over a policeman's son in King Street. So Gary Abdallah was no angel, let me say, although one of his brothers contacts me regularly and has a bit to say about the fight to clear Gary's name and to push the case that he was killed unjustly, which may be so. Gary Abdallah was shot dead with 7 shots from 2 police pistols in a rented flat in Carlton. Now, the trigger was pulled 7 times on those 2 pistols by a crazed young detective called Cliff Lockwood, who later, and not because of this, but probably subsequently rather than consequently, lost his career as a Victoria policeman and then his freedom, and ended up in the Northern Territory serving time on serious drug charges, which I think is a story we've been through on this podcast in the past. The patchy life and times of Cliff Lockwood. Lockwood, as most people will remember, said that he and a fellow policeman, Dermot Avon, went to that flat which had been under surveillance. They knew that the audio bug had been taken out and was dead, and that therefore they weren't being monitored. Lockwood, presumably acting on his own initiative here, not with the agreement of his colleague, Dermot Avon, went in first into a room where Gary Abdallah was, and he claims that Gary Abdallah produced a weapon, or what looked like a weapon, a firearm, and therefore he shot him many times, which he did. He emptied his police pistol into Abdallah's body, including some shots which entered his back and I think his head. It did have the hallmarks of a sort of a frenzied execution. He then, having emptied his pistol, turned around to a very shocked and stunned Dermot Avon and took his pistol from him and turned back and shot Abdallah again. Now, interestingly, those who would defend Lockwood's actions, and some very reasonable people do, say that the very fact that he was so frenzied meant that he hadn't planned it, that he was acting with a burst of adrenaline because he was genuinely frightened or feared for his life. Subsequently, the search found a toy gun in the Abdallah apartment. It was a replica, which of course looked real. There's no doubt that replicas that look real are just as frightening as any other gun. No problems with that. But there was a suggestion that the replica had been seen in the police property office down at City West Police Station sometime earlier. There was a policeman who wanted to give evidence to that effect, that that's where that replica came from, which would imply that that replica was what they call a throwaway or a throwdown, that is, a weapon placed after the event to make it look as if the shooting victim was in fact armed. And that is conceivable, given what Cliff Lockwood went on to do, which was to become essentially a drug trafficker and a very dishonest and violent man. It's possible that that's what happened. The other Walsh Street trigger man, or thought to be a trigger man, was a brooding young fellow called Jed Horton. Now, he was 23 years old. Not a lot's known about him, except he was pretty active, pretty willing, as they say. Certainly some sort of apprentice bank robber. So he was running around with the sort of people that could get him killed, and indeed they did get him killed. He was shot at point-blank range with shotguns by members of the Special Operations Group in a cabin at a Bendigo caravan park. Now, there were some similarities between Horton's death and what Graham Jensen's family still label as the execution of their brother, Graham, at Narre Warren by a posse of detectives in what I would call, a recklessly lethal action, the one that prompted the payback killing of Tynan and Eyre in Walsh Street the next day. Because as most people remember, the shooting of the police in Walsh Street came the very day after the shooting of the armed robber Graham Jensen at Narre Warren. Jed Horton had it coming. As the saying goes, he was heavily armed and he was certainly dangerous. But you'd have to say that Graham Jensen's death and Gary Abdallah's death still trouble their families and their friends, which is why families and friends and various activist lawyers still pursue these cases in the media and sometimes through legal channels. There are probably a few sceptical lawyers and journalists, maybe even a few uneasy former police who believe that a reckless police action had precipitated what happened at Walsh Street and afterwards. You'd have to say that despite the subsequent legal proceedings which cleared those who pulled the trigger at Narre Warren and at Abdallah's flat, that those two police shootings probably don't pass the sniff test, the pub test. The Walsh Street shootings have left some other loose ends too, such as what happened to the police service revolver that one of the killers snatched from Damien Eyre's holster and used to execute him. Damien Eyre, the young fella, had already been shot with a shotgun. He was probably dying anyway, but one of the killers, one of the shooters, grabbed his police pistol, hauled it out and shot him at point-blank range to execute him, the coup de grace. And that revolver, as far as I know, has never been found. Now, the other weapon was a KTG shotgun, and this is a Japanese brand 12-gauge shotgun. Not a rare weapon in itself. There were plenty of them made, but only about 42 of that model, this pump-action shotgun, had been released in Melbourne or in Victoria for whatever reason. And among that lot were a couple, I think, that, or at least one, that had been stolen in a raid on a gun shop in Moonee Ponds. And that particular weapon made its way, as stolen weapons often do, into the hands of, even worse crooks who were going to use them to create mayhem. And that weapon was sawn down. I think it had its stock sawn down into a pistol grip and the barrel shortened so that it effectively became like a long pump-action shotgun pistol arrangement, which would fit, in somebody's coat pocket, because it'd be about, say, 40 centimetres long. You could disguise it fairly easily to carry it around in a bag or something like that. And so it was a very fearsome thing because it would spray shot broadly. It was pump action, which meant you could rapid fire however many cartridges it held, probably held 8 or 9 cartridges. And it was a very dangerous weapon, which is one of the reasons that pump action shotguns have been banned for normal use in more recent years. Now, this KTG shotgun had been identified by brilliant police work from photographs which had been taken from still security footage from bank robberies. They were able to focus on one frame which showed somebody holding this sawn-off shotgun, and they were able to identify what it was, and I think they might have been able to read the serial number, something like that. Pretty good police work. And they were able to work out that these robbers used this particular gun, and they suspected that that was the gun used at Walsh Street. And indeed, that was pretty well proven later when a gardener dug it up, wrapped in black plastic, up in a garden in Royal Park near the zoo. It was quite a while later. It was, the following year or whatever. And when it was dug up, it had been there long enough that it had become rusted and sort of damaged by water and weather and so on. But it was easily recognisable as the sawn-off KTG shotgun used by that particular robbery gang, the Victor Pearce, Peter McAvoy gang that had pulled several robberies with their mate Graham Jensen, I have to say. Why those fellows would wrap that in black plastic and bury it in a shallow hole rather than throw it off the Westgate Bridge into deep water, I don't know, but it proves the point that even what you would call expert career criminals often don't do expert career criminal things. They should always get rid of weapons like that have been used particularly in a police shooting, let alone anything else. But they didn't. They wrapped it up and buried it under 6 inches of earth in a reasonably public place. And that would suggest that they were considering that they could go back and get it if they wanted it, which is probably a human failing. The fact that they did that suggests to me that it's likely, if not probable, but at least likely, that the police revolver stolen from Damien Eyre's holster by probably that piece of vermin, Peter McAvoy, the man they call Bubble Brain, there's every chance that it too wasn't disposed of. There's every chance that it wasn't thrown off the Westgate Bridge or thrown in the Yarra or burnt, crushed and buried. It was quite possibly secreted somewhere where they could get it again, or sold or traded or somehow disposed of like that, whatever. Because crooks do stupid things, or else they wouldn't be crooks. Crooks consume alcohol and drugs in vast quantities, and crooks essentially are gamblers, and the biggest gamble they take is gambling against their own freedom. So they do stupid stuff that leads to trouble for them and everybody else. And we'll be back after this. People will assert that no real crook or no good crook would ever not get rid of a weapon, but the facts are that, by and large, many of them don't get rid of weapons that they should get rid of, and there's some more recent examples. One is when a former soldier shot a rebel spiky boss called Nick Martin over in Perth, at a motorway in Perth last December. Now, this soldier was some sort of mercenary, I think, an illegal mercenary soldier, had been an Australian soldier in the Australian Army. He was clearly a good shot, but not a heavy thinker, bad thinker, because when the investigators looking for the shooter of this Nick Martin went around looking for the most likely candidates, they soon worked out that this bloke was one of them, because he was probably one of the few reputed mercenaries in Perth for a start. And when they went to his house in Perth to talk to him and search the premises and around the premises, guess what they found? They found the very rifle that he used to shoot Nick Martin. And, of course, within a matter of a day, the police were able to prove that the ballistics from that rifle matched the bullet recovered from Nick Martin's body, and so on and so forth. And that man was locked up for a very, very long time. So he should be, A, for perpetrating a murder, which is a very evil thing to do, and B, for sheer stupidity. There is another example of this. You could say, well, a soldier isn't a real crook, soldier fond of his weapon, whatever. What about this one? Very cagey career criminal called James Iceman Bazley. Now, Bazley only left us a couple of years ago when he was in his 90s. Very old man, and one of the rare ones who lived by the gun all his life. It was an armed robber and a killer and a violent crook all his life, yet lived to a very ripe old age. And long-term listeners will recall hearing about him over decades, essentially. He was the man who was nominated correctly as the bloke who shot Donald Mackay in Griffith back in 1977. And what the police found there, they never found Mackay's body, but they did find blood stains in the car park where Donald Mackay was basically shot and abducted, or abducted and shot. And beside the blood stains, they found at least one empty .22 bullet case. And they were able to study that. The ballistics people worked out that it came from a French-made Unique .22, was its brand name, Unique. That was the model or the brand. And funnily enough, when Bazley was grabbed for the murder of a pair of Kiwi drug runners called Douglas and Isabel Wilson, drug mules really, they were pretty down the scale, he buried their bodies in a shallow grave down at Rye, right near a house that he and his wife used to use quite a lot, because his wife used to act as housekeeper for the people that owned the house. And so there we have again, sort of a stupid, lazy action by a lazy crook who should have known better. And when the police went to interview Bazley about the two Wilsons in the shallow grave, they had him banged to rights, and they searched his possessions and they found their French-made Unique pistol. I think that's true, that he still had that murder weapon around, and that was one of the things that told against him. There was something else that he did, which is an intriguing thing. It shows that he was pig-headed and that he would go against logical planning. He was told by the person who was to pay him, that was Aussie Bob Trimboli, the mafia sort of money man. He was told to kill the Wilsons because they were police informers, And he was told, get rid of the bodies and so on. And he was also told to make sure that he killed their dog. And the pet dog had come to Australia from New Zealand with them, proving that they loved it dearly and wouldn't travel without it. And that was obvious. And that was why the mafia boss said, well, when you shoot them, you better kill the dog too, because the story's going to be that they've left Australia with a false passport to go overseas. And the dog, if it's found, everyone will know that something bad has happened to them. Don't you know it? Jimmy Baisley knew better. He said, no, I'm a dog lover. He and his wife, I think Lillian, her name was, she might still be alive. She could be listening. I think Jim Baisley and Lillian used to breed poodles, and they were dog lovers. Baisley said something like, why should the dog get it? It's never done anything wrong. Never lagged on anybody. So he refused to shoot the dog. The dog was turned loose and the dog was found. And indeed, it was identified as the dog belonging to the dead couple, the murdered couple. It was quite a rare breed. I think it was a Belgian barge dog. And as such, stood out when it was run into the pound in Brunswick or somewhere. I think it had been let out on the way to the airport. I reckon Baisley took their car and left it in the airport car park to add to the idea that they'd bolted overseas on false passports, but that he'd let the dog out on the way in somewhere like Brunswick. And that's where the dog was found wandering around. So there you have examples of career crooks doing dumb stuff with guns and dogs, let alone anything else that would connect them to a crime. And this brings us to this rather interesting tale that I've heard very recently about Ayres' revolver, or what could be Constable Damien Ayres' stolen police revolver, which would be a Smith & Wesson 38 in those days. Now, it's a chance that it would be the sort of macabre trophy that would appeal to the twisted tastes of the deviant, violent piece of shite that was Peter alias Bubble Brain McAvoy, who was just the total black sheep of his family. McAvoy had brothers that were, I think one was a prison officer and one was a policeman, something like that. Their father had been the chauffeur at Government House and had chauffeured members of the royal family and the governor and all sorts of VIPs around Victoria in a Rolls Royce and all that sort of stuff. But Peter McAvoy, for no known reason, had been a wrong-un from a very young age. He had been part of a gang of young men who raped a whole series of teenage schoolgirls in Heidelberg in the 1970s. Probably, there might have been 15 or 20 girls, lots of victims. He was regarded even in criminal circles as a pervert and a psychopath. His sometime girlfriend, if he ever had a permanent girlfriend, I don't know that he did have, but those who'd associated with him feared him and hated him because he demanded what they call jail sex. And therefore he was in every way likely to be the sort of reptile that would be weird enough and stupid enough to want to keep the murdered policeman's pistol. And if he did that, well, what we don't know is what happened to it later. Maybe a bloke like that could end up broke, as they usually do, and he might go and fetch it out and sell it to somebody for $1,000 or whatever because he needed the money. Those things happen all the time. We do know that McAvoy did boast at least once and maybe more about killing Damien Ayres, a revolting and repelling thing to say. But we don't know what he or his co-offenders did with the pistol. Well, there are 2 or 3 stories, that any one of which might be true. A few years ago, an old knockabout burglar and shopbreaker, this guy, and a bit of a greyhound man. He was an interesting old crook. I would have said not a violent man, just a shifty and shady guy. But we often talk about different things. We'll call him Mac. That's not his real name, but we'll call him Mac. Mac told me that he'd met Jed Horton shortly before the Walsh St murders, and he had a vague idea that he was running around with, a bunch of robbers, and he knew he wasn't a clean skin. And I think the week that Jed Horton was shot dead, Jed Horton came over to see old Mac in his house in suburban Melbourne. Let's just say the western suburbs, doesn't matter where. And he said, can you drive me to somewhere? And Mac says, yeah. So doesn't ask questions, just drives him. Now, Horton guides him to a spot down Pascoe Vale Road, turn left, whatever. And they parked near a high school that's right near the Tullamarine Freeway in Strathmore, essentially. And if you parked near this school at Strathmore, certainly back then, you could look down over the Moonee Ponds Creek, which is just a concrete gutter, really, and at the incoming and outgoing lanes of the freeway. And Mac sat in the car, and young Horton got out of the passenger seat, and he had with him a plastic shopping bag. Mac says he didn't know what was in the shopping bag. He would naturally say that. But he suspects that, it might have been a gun, or it might have been cash, or it might have been both. He doubts that he was, burying a Agatha Christie novel or something, or spare clothes. It would be something that would be hot, that he wanted to hide. And so this young fellow, Horton, walks down the slope over the creek, according to Mac, who watched him. He said he vaulted over the guardrail, and then he crossed the freeway. There was pretty light traffic on this evening. It was might have been reasonably late in the year, and there was a bit of light. But anyway, he could see him cross the freeway. And when he got to the other side of the freeway, he sort of walked up the slope, the bank part, to a tree. There were some shrubs, small trees planted there. And he said he knelt down, and this is, by this stage he's 400 metres away or something, fair way off. And he said he saw him kneel down and apparently bury the bag, because he came back without the bag. And Mac, wondered what it was all about, but just pretended he hadn't been watching and didn't ask any questions. And he drove the fella where he wanted to go, and that was that. And within a matter of days, Horton was shot extremely dead in the cabin in the caravan park at Bendigo. Many years later, Mac told me that story, and in fact took me out to the spot. And we jumped over a fence into the freeway reserve and walked down the slope and sort of cast about looking to see if there were any obvious spots. But there's a fair chance that the freeway landscaping has altered quite a lot, which could mean that package, if it was buried as he thought, could have been found by somebody, some worker, earth worker or gardener or whatever, and been removed. And if it was cash, there's every chance that would happen. You'd think if it was a gun that maybe it would be handed in, but you never know. The second story is this. In around 2004, a very hard-looking tattooed guy and his very quiet, good-looking girlfriend turned up in a remote district up near Cooktown in far north Queensland. Now, this place is a little former mining sort of district, mining town, one pub, one shop, one of those places out on the highway to nowhere, really. And it's well past Cairns, and it's south of Cooktown. And the couple were in a fast blue Ford utility. It was a pretty go-y sort of car. The guy used to drive fast, used to scare locals because he drove fast. The woman called the driver, the tough-looking guy, she called him Nev, and he called her Julie. Now, whether these were their real names, I don't know, but there's a fair chance they were. They were from Melbourne. They weren't exactly fugitives in the sense that I don't think they were running from, they weren't jailbreakers. And I don't know that they were running from the law necessarily, but they were certainly running from their past. They may well have had enemies in Melbourne for whatever reason, to do with brothels, to do with drugs, the usual things, and to do with money, probably. It would appear, as he told the local publican over many weeks and several months, it would appear that he'd been sort of a standover man and a pimp. Now, when I say a pimp, I mean the guy that is a security guard for prostitutes in a brothel, that guy that acts as security, drives the girls home, in this case would distribute drugs to them and collect money from them, and in this case to distribute drugs to the prostitutes who were mostly drug addicted in those days, and to collect money back from them in that never-ending circle of evil that happens with the sex industry, drug addicted people who are paid in drugs and pay the drug dealers in cash. Now, Julie had been an addict and a hooker. Neville had been standover man, drug dealer, drug deliverer, and quite possibly a gunman, it would appear. He was a pretty heavy sort of bloke. Now, they rented one of the empty workers' houses that had been abandoned when the local mine was closed, and they used to drink at the pub when it was empty, which it often was, and they ended up taking the publican into their confidence. And it's the publican that told me this story after I was put in touch with him by a sort of a friend of a friend. Now, Nev said that he'd been a criminal since his teens. He said he used to row rowboats out into the Port Phillip Bay to collect heroin from bigger boats that brought it in from the ships or whatever, which probably makes sense, to be honest. And he told him all about his life of crime. He told one story about delivering drums of hash oil to Adelaide, and on one occasion he couldn't do it, and a mate of his had done the run delivering the hash oil to Adelaide, had been hijacked and murdered. And Nev was so upset about this event, this mate of his doing him the favour, that he cried when he told the publican the story, which made the publican think, I think this bloke might be telling the truth or a version of it, because he said in pubs you do hear a lot of people tell a lot of lies, but not all of them. One of the stories that Nev told the publican is that when he used to do heavy things in Melbourne, and by this he meant stand over with gun or perhaps shoot people with gun, he would go and obtain a handgun from a particular source, and he would pay that source for the use of the gun, and then he would return it later. Now, that too would break all sorts of criminal etiquette, and it wouldn't make a lot of sense for anybody to want to take back a gun that had been used, that had been fired anyway. But it may well be that this is a true story or a version thereof. And he said this particular pistol that he used to get was nicknamed the Redback. And he also told the publican that he believed that the Redback was the pistol taken from two police who had been shot in Melbourne. Now, he didn't say the words Walsh Street. And the publican, who was a guy who'd lived in Queensland all his life and had been in, I think, the Navy before that, he didn't really know much about Walsh Street at all, this publican. And he just sort of took the story at face value. And it was only when he told someone who told a former Victorian detective that they put two and two together and said, I wonder if that was Damien Eyre's pistol, if some idiot has given it to some other idiot who then lends it to a third idiot like Nev who does crimes with it. And it's conceivable. I'm not saying it's likely, but it might be, because a lot of crooks do dumb things. And we'll be back after this to finish our story. When I told that story to another former detective, he said, well, I've got another story. And he told me that he had in fact negotiated a $300,000 deal between a commercial television station, that's the station in Melbourne that now owns a newspaper, and Wendy Pearce, the widow of the late Victor Pearce, who of course was the main man in the Walsh Street shootings. And the deal was for Wendy Pearce to reveal where that pistol was. And she said that she knew where it was buried. Now, whether this was just a sheer fabrication, a big lie by Wendy, or whether it was true and then she got cold feet, we don't know. But the fact is, the ex-detective tells me, she reneged on the deal at the last minute, and she ended up putting on a scene in the street and saying, no, I can't take you because, she made some excuse and abused him and carried on. And he said it was clear that either she couldn't deliver on the promise of taking a film crew to find the pistol, or she'd been told by a lawyer that if she did that, there was every chance she could be charged. And so the ex-detective thinks that she probably got cold feet because of her legal position, and that's why she didn't go through with it. Had she gone through with it, the ex-detective thinks Wendy Pearce probably would have been charged. And a lot of people would like to see that happen because really, there's an old saying, what goes around comes around. Thanks for listening. Life and Crimes is a Sunday Herald Sun production for True Crime Australia. Our producer is Jonty Burton. If you like the show, leave a 5-star rating and a review wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to know more about these stories, links are in the description of this episode.